At that very precise moment, fortunately, Wallace sent a telegram to the White House saying he'd like to meet with the president to discuss the situation. Johnson said, well, you just come right ahead.
That was the most amazing conversation I've ever been present at, because here was Lyndon Johnson, the consummate politician, and George Wallace just didn't know what was going on at that meeting.
Wallace is about 5'4", and Johnson is about 6'4". So he leads Wallace in, he sits him down on the couch. Wallace sinks down, so he's now about 3 feet tall. And Johnson sits at the edge of the rocking chair, leaning over him.
George, he said, "Do you see all those demonstrators out in front of the White House?" "Oh, yes, Mr. President, I saw them." He said, "Wouldn't it be just wonderful if we could put an end to all those demonstrations?" "Oh, yes, Mr. President, that would be wonderful." He said, "Why don't you and I go out there, George? With all those television cameras, did you see those television cameras?" "Oh, yes, I saw them." He says, "Let's you and I go out there and let's announce that you've decided to integrate every school in Alabama."
And his Southern voice always deepened when he spoke to other Southern. He says, "Now you agree that Negroes got the right to vote, don't you?" He says, "Oh, yes, Mr. President, there's no question of that." He says, "Well, then why don't you let them vote?" And he said, "Well, you know," he said, "they don't have that power. That belongs to the county registrars in the state of Alabama."
And Johnson went back and he says, "George," he said, "don't you shit me as to who runs Alabama."
And Wallace insisted, no, he didn't have the legal authority. He said, "Well, why don't you persuade them, George?" He said, "Well, I don't think I could do that." He said, "Now, don't shit me about your persuasive power, George." He said, "You know, I sit down in bed in the morning when I get up and I got 3 TV sets lying, running right out after the other. And I got a little button I can press and I click, and whenever I see something I'm interested in, I press the button and the sound goes on. And I was headed on this morning and I saw you and I pressed the button and you were talking." He said, "And you was attacking me, George." He said, "Well, I wasn't attacking you, Mr. President. I was attacking the whole principle of states' rights." And he says, "You was attacking me, George." He says, "You were so damn persuasive." He says, "I almost changed my mind." Well, this goes on for half an hour or more, and then finally he turns to Wallace and he said, "George, you and I shouldn't be thinking about 1964. We should be thinking about 1984. We'll both be dead and gone then," he said. "Now, you get a lot of poor people down there in Alabama, a lot of ignorant people, a lot of people who need jobs, a lot of people who need a future." He said, "You could do a lot for them." He says, "Now, in 1984, George," he said, "what do you want left behind?" He said, "You want a great, big marble monument that says, 'George Wallace, he built,' or do you want a little piece of scrawny pine laying there along that harsh caliche soil that says, 'George Wallace, he hated'?"
In the end, Wallace